Well, hi everyone. I'm honored to have the opportunity to be with you here today, albeit virtually. I really enjoyed attending this conference during the many years I was a professor at Ohio State University. So really a big thank you to the organizers of this conference this year and through the years, and also to all of you for tuning in. I think we've all seen these sobering headlines over the last few years. So these large-scale and long-term studies have shown that there have been massive declines in biodiversity around the world. One of the studies really hit close to home, and that's this one that was published in 2019 in Science magazine. So this work was led by Ken Rosenberg at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, along with an international team of collaborators. And they analyzed two different data sets in order to track how populations of 530 species of birds have changed since 1970. And so the two data sets were the breeding bird survey data. This is run by the USGS and has been operating since 1966. And the other data set comes from NexRad radar images. And so these can now be used to monitor migrating birds. And what the researchers found was really shocking. Nearly 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. That's 30% of the breeding population in North America, or nearly 1 in 3 birds. Now, declines span most groups of birds, including many common species. What you can see here in this pie chart is that sparrows, warblers, and blackbirds had the greatest absolute losses. And these graphs, you can see how declines varied across habitats, with each habitat being color-coded. So on the graph that would be furthest to your left, you can see changes in the numbers of birds. And so birds associated with grasslands lost the most. You can see that in this tan line here. In the middle graphic, you can see the percent of the population that was lost. So here again, grassland birds declined by half. Birds of the Arctic tundra, boreal or western forest declined by about a third. Interestingly, at the bottom, you can see the return on U.S. investments in wetland conservation, right? They actually, the species associated with wetlands actually increased over that time. Now, the farthest to the right, you'll see pie charts that indicate the proportion of species within that habitat guild that have experienced declines. And so what this really shows you is that we're not talking about just a couple of species within that habitat that might be really, dominating and responsible for the trends. That's not the case. For grassland birds, Arctic tundra birds, about 3/4 have been declining. Boreal forest birds, about half. So you can really see that for these habitats, these declines are really span most of the guild and are serious. Now, massive losses have occurred, not only among rare species, but also common ones. And that's one of the things that's most worrisome. And so here you can see as an example, the eastern meadowlark. So we've lost 3 in 4 eastern meadowlarks since 1970. And what's important to recognize is that these declining populations are not in small pockets here and there. On these graphs, you're looking at maps of breeding bird survey data, where you see red and orange that indicates where populations are declining. And so for both eastern and western meadowlarks, you can see that they're declining throughout most of their range. We also are seeing massive declines in other birds as well. So for example, boreal forest birds as a whole have declined by about a third, but for some species, like the evening grosbeak shown here, 9 of every 10 individuals has been lost. Eastern forest birds also declining over the entire guild by about declining by 17% since 1970. But again, some once common species are really showing signals of trouble. Here we see wood thrushes have lost 6 of every 10 individuals. And even the familiar barn swallow has declined along with other aerial insectivores. And these, of course, are the birds that are eating mosquitoes and other flying insects and performing really important ecosystem services. We see that migratory birds also have declined substantially by 28% since 1970. Baltimore orioles, a bird that you might be very familiar with, coming in to eat oranges if you were to leave them out in the spring and summer, they've lost 2 in 5 individuals. So here on the right, you're seeing an animation that's produced using eBird data that have been analyzed by our status and trends team. And this is showing the annual distribution and abundance of the barn swallow. And so the brighter the colors, the more abundant the species is at that location. So here, this animation is really a reminder that when we're talking about migratory birds and the declines we're seeing, it can be really difficult to know where, which stage of the annual cycle is most important in actually exposing these birds to threats. And what the study, the science paper showed, is that the severity of declines among migratory birds actually varies substantially depending on where they're wintering. And so here on this graph, we can see that, again, on the left, for birds that are wintering in the southwest arid lands, and so this is color-coded to the map again, so you can see in the gold color, as well as birds in South America and in coastal and marine areas, so think shorebirds. These are all birds that have declined enormously since the 70s. And once again, when you look at those pie charts, you can see that for many of these sort of wintering guilds, if we were to call them that, most of the species, or a substantial proportion of the species, are in a state of decline. Okay, so, when we look overall, and the news is not good, right? But how do we turn this around? What do we need? The conservation community has long known the major threats to birds. And we've worked together really well in many cases and for decades to try to address these threats. So individually as different organizations, as well as collectively as a profession. But now it's really time to take a fresh look at our approaches and ask ourselves how we can do better. Right? We know we can do this. Right? We've seen that when the conservation community acts strategically and decisively, that we actually can reverse declines. So I'll focus the remainder of my talk around how we might want to think differently about what we focus on, where and when we direct our conservation efforts, and with whom we partner. Now, these ideas aren't necessarily new, right? They're reflected in many of the conversations we've been having with each other and that have been occurring in the profession overall. My goal today is to really bring them together along with some examples to remind and hopefully encourage us to be more deliberate and creative about the strategies that we're using today. Okay, so for the first part, we'll focus on the what. Right? What should the focus or the target of our conservation efforts be? Now, obviously, we all know the importance of identifying and clearly articulating a target for our actions. We already do this, right? My suggestion here is that we can actually do better at aligning these targets with other co-benefits, or other societal goals or outcomes that we want to achieve. So here I've shown the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, right? And these include things like reducing poverty, hunger, conflict, safeguarding healthy environments and ecosystem services, creating fair and equitable communities in the world where people are secure and have access to the resources they need. These are the kinds of goals that we might consider really integrating into our conservation efforts, at least in some cases where we can, in order to draw in more support and perhaps more funding. And there is such enormous opportunity to incorporate these kinds of co-benefits. Right now, co-benefits might be very specific, like where one might restore a wetland, and you're trying to conserve not only the sensitive wildlife that are using that space, but also doing it in a place where you get meaningful improvements to clean water or important reductions in risks of flooding. Right? The idea is that we need to do more with less. Right? That's just the reality of our times today. And we see opportunities to do this, right, at local scales all the way up to international. So for example, here I'm showing the Bond Challenge. So this is a global initiative to restore hundreds of millions of hectares of degraded and deforested land. Now, the central motivation for this Bond Challenge is to help ameliorate climate change and also to support national and local economies. Right? Because we know that healthy environments tend to be more productive, and that will be better for human communities. Now, of course, there's far more degraded and deforested land than we can possibly restore as part of this initiative or any others. So that means we have to make choices about where we're going to try to restore forest or other lands. Now, these choices can include then not only thinking about biodiversity, as many of us probably first focus on within this room, virtual room, but these choices can also include incorporating ecosystem services, or what now people are increasingly calling nature's contributions to people. So for example, maybe we could prioritize restorations in areas where they're most likely to protect threatened and endangered species or improve water quality. We can also use this co-benefit lens to integrate conservation into the private sector efforts as well. So for example, Walmart's Project Gigaton aims to reduce a gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions from their supply chain by 2030. Soil management is the cornerstone of this particular approach, but they want to do more, right? Especially related to biodiversity conservation. So we could contribute to this by trying to help them assess where they might be able to direct those soil interventions in a way or in a place that also has important benefits for birds. Being strategic about co-benefits is really important for cultivating support, even for public policies. I think the Farm Bill is an excellent example of this. Right? We're all aware of how valuable the Farm Bill's conservation programs are for wildlife, especially for grassland birds and waterfowl, but they also provide billions of dollars in ecosystem services. And these co-benefits are really essential to sustaining and growing political support. Okay, for the next theme, I'm going to discuss, really more about where we direct our conservation efforts. And two of the main recommendations here are that we have to continue to include working landscapes in our planning, as well as utilize new approaches that allow us to be more strategic and optimize our conservation efforts spatially. It's funny because I think that many people, sort of out in the public, still think that conservation is something that happens within designated areas, right? Protected areas, reserves, what have you. But of course we know better than that. Now, protected areas certainly do play important roles, right? In many cases, those roles are irreplaceable. We're just simply not going to be able to meet our conservation goals without those protected areas. But we're also not going to meet them in many cases if we aren't including working landscapes and private lands. So the reason why we have to really look then outside of protected areas, so I guess there are a few lines of reasoning, right? One of these is that ecological pressures continue even when an area is protected. Right, here you're looking at results from an analysis of 60 protected areas across 36 countries. And what the researchers found was that even when you establish a reserve, many of those ecological pressures continue to worsen over time. Maybe not as bad as outside reserves, but what we see is that if we're not addressing the pressure itself, we're not always going to be solving the problem or having positive outcomes for conservation. We also know that most of the land in the contiguous U.S. is privately owned, especially in the eastern U.S. And certain habitats are overwhelmingly in private ownership. If we look here at this graph, eastern forests and grasslands, coastal areas, overwhelmingly privately owned. A previous State of the Bird report found that over 100 species of birds have over half of their distribution on private land. And so we need to look to that and find ways to conserve. Here in this example, we'll go back to grassland birds, right? One of the most strongly declining groups that was reported in the 3 Billion Birds paper. And so here you're looking at the distribution of grassland birds. And we see again that most of them are distributed on private land. So what this tells us is that we need to work with landowners and we need to work with the private sector. I want to highlight the fact that this is a reality that's not true only in the US or in North America, but we actually see the importance of unprotected areas to migratory birds across their full annual cycle. So in this paper that was published a few years ago, we analyzed 21 focal species of neotropical migratory birds and analyzed eBird data to see where the birds spent most of their time. And what you're seeing with the colors here are in yellow, that shows the areas of the greatest use, so they're spending the most time there. So you can see like the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America really light up, right? So over the course of a year, that's where birds are actually spending most of their time. One of the key findings of this study was that migratory birds use mostly unprotected land across the year. In this graph on the left, you can see the percent of the annual distribution of this group of birds that occurred on lands with high levels of protection. So those are things like wilderness areas, and that's shown in the red line. You can see that's very few, less than 2% of the distribution. We can look then at this blue line, which are areas with medium levels of protection. Right? And those are like national parks. And then low levels of protection are lands that have multiple uses that are permitted. So like the Forest Service, National Forests or BLM land. But again, overall, what you can see is that across the year, birds are mostly using unprotected land. So this is underscoring the importance of really focusing on working landscapes and private lands as we're crafting strategies to achieve our conservation goals at scale. So that insight, along with many others, was possible because of new and growing crowdsourced data or citizen science data that offer us unparalleled coverage and resolution in terms of space and time. So eBird, which is the example I'm showing here, is a citizen science project that's run by the Cornell Lab. And cumulatively now, over 655,000 eBirders have submitted nearly 1 billion observations from around the world. So those abundance data can be used in really kind of exciting ways when we combine them with spatial optimization algorithms. This allows us to prioritize locations for conservation. So here on this slide, you're seeing the results of an analysis of 400 neotropical migratory birds, where we tried to identify the most important stopover areas in fall and in spring. We further identified which sites were shared, they were high priority in fall and spring, and which ones were already protected. Again, this kind of information can help planners and practitioners direct their limited resources to the places that they're most likely to get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of conservation outcomes. And with eBird data, we're now able to prioritize sites across the full annual cycle and the entire Western Hemisphere. So here, you're looking at priority sites for 117 species of songbirds, so that's on the left, and for 41 species of shorebirds. Again, this just allows us to be so much more strategic in where we're working. And these kinds of approaches can also be adjusted to help planners evaluate trade-offs with other activities. So in this example, we overlaid the most important places for overwintering neotropical migratory birds with concessions for mining explorations that have been granted by the governments of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Again, here, these kinds of analyses can help governments determine which mines, if they were actually developed, would incur significant costs for bird conservation. And knowledge provides power and options. So most commonly, I think we ask the question of where conservation could happen, right? But increasingly, we should also be asking when conservation could happen, because not all conservation has to be static or permanent, right? Sometimes it could be more dynamic or temporary, or even very precise into where and when interventions are happening. So that makes a lot of sense when we think about migratory birds. Right? So in this animation, you're watching the centroid of the distribution of different bird species. So each dot is a different species. And we're watching that distribution change as the year progresses. So you can imagine that in some of these locations, certain human activities might only need to temporarily be modified in order to accommodate those species. In addition to meeting temporary needs, dynamic approaches to conservation are well suited for being used in changing environments, where the most important places might be changing over time, like with climate change, or maybe when one is conserving an ephemeral habitat, or ones that have highly variable levels of resources. They can also be game changers when we're working in regions where land is in high demand for other uses and might be cost prohibitive to permanently protect. So consider haying and grassland birds, right? We might not need to stop all of the haying to improve nesting success. Maybe we just need to delay one of the haying cycles in a way where, and do that in a way where we can actually incentivize or maybe compensate farmers for taking those steps. We actually use that kind of approach in a project with the Nature Conservancy, where most wetland habitats in the Central Valley of California were long ago converted to rice fields. So the problem is that this area is really important for migrating waterfowl and shorebirds. Now, rice fields can actually provide decent stopover habitat when they're flooded. The issue is that the normal management cycle for rice fields involves drawing down water levels when there are still large numbers of birds using them. So you can see this on that graph, right? So the line in the background shows the abundance of a lot of the migrating birds that are using those sites. So we worked with the Nature Conservancy to use eBird to identify the areas that were most heavily used by birds, then to use water models in order to predict where water was most likely to be on the landscape in the subsequent year. So that helps us know where our efforts need to be directed. So in other words, we don't want to try to work with farmers or spend limited resources trying to encourage farmers to keep water on rice fields where there was already likely to be water nearby in other locations. So what this approach did, though, it was really important because it allowed the Nature Conservancy to really price the conservation value of those interventions in different locations, right? So they could look and knowing where birds were, where the water was likely to be. They, again, know where it's most important or most valuable to add water. And so the farmers were then asked how much they would want to be paid in order to keep water on their rice fields, so to keep them flooded for an additional few weeks. This is called a reverse auction because the farmer actually sets the price. So TNC could then compare those bids to the predicted sort of conservation value that those fields have, and then choose which would be most beneficial to birds. And this program was hugely successful. It saved over $150 million compared with a more traditional approach like buying the land or establishing easements. And it also resulted in measurable increases in the number of water birds that were supported in the region. Another example of dynamic conservation is an extension of the lab's Birdcast project, which makes forecasts of nocturnal bird migration in real time. So scientists for this project have combined citizen science data with weather radar data. And so here we're looking at the weather radar network in the US. So this has collected data for over 24 years. It's all freely available. So what you're seeing here is a pulse of bird migration, and you can see that that pulsing is birds sort of lifting off in the evening as they're about to migrate. Some of those bigger systems you see moving across are storms. So we can use those data across years to develop predictive models that help us to predict where and when bird migration is going to be heavy. So that's what you're looking at here, kind of the direction of migration, and that's colors are showing that's where the migration is really, is most intense. Again, this is across the last 24 years. So from those models, we can actually generate really incredible forecasts like this one, where you can see night by night for either the US as a whole or for particular regions, we can actually estimate the number of birds that are forecast to migrate and where that's going to occur across the country. And these forecasts can translate into real conservation action. And so we've worked with partners to actually establish lights out programs. And sometimes those can be timed, where lights are being turned off in cities on the nights that are most important for migrating birds. And we can actually issue alerts to different cities. Just as an aside, in my little screen view might block it, but Laura Bush recorded a Facebook or a Twitter video in order to really try to encourage people to participate in this program. And so we're attracting some big attention. So last, we come to the question of who we should engage or partner with. Now, I want to be clear that our traditional partners remain incredibly valuable. Right? We want to maintain and strengthen those partnerships while also cultivating new ones with non-traditional partners and with broader groups of stakeholders. We might even look more regularly to the private sector. And this is especially true because businesses are tuning in more and more to corporate responsibility and recognizing the need to meet environmental, social, and governance standards. Now, motivations vary, but many businesses realize that being sustainable is good practice and it's good for the bottom line. So for example, we're now working with Nespresso to develop a bird-based biodiversity progress index that can be used to monitor outcomes of their sustainable practices, such as planting trees on coffee farms. Now, I realize that monitoring or measuring is not necessarily the same as actually conserving, but it's an important step in the process. And there's opportunity for NGOs and agencies and academics to partner with the private sector to both design and implement these kinds of monitoring programs, ideally within an adaptive management framework that allows for the science, to really identify the best practices, but also that supports continuous improvement for the business. And encouragingly, we're also seeing growing interest in biodiversity conservation from the finance community, especially related to monitoring and rating or benchmarking the impact of different investment portfolios on biodiversity conservation. Assessing the impact of an investment portfolio on biodiversity seems like a pretty big ask, I know. But let's remember that effectively we're building global networks of sensors, human sensors, in our citizen science projects. And we also are continuing to increase the sophistication of remote sensing technology. So this is going to be within reach. One of the reasons that we really need to start thinking more creatively about who we engage with for conservation is this reality. If we're going to conserve biodiversity at scale, we need to develop innovative ways to generate new funding streams. That's the reality. There have been recent estimates published about the amount of funding that's required to conserve biodiversity globally. And so here you're looking at one of these, a graph from a recent report, Financing Nature. And so it's been estimated that between 700 and over 900 billion US dollars each year is required to conserve biodiversity at scale. Right? And here you're looking at the different colors reflect how those funding levels are estimated across different habitats. So the problem is we don't have that much money. There's an enormous gap in biodiversity funds, over $700 billion. Now, most of the funding that's currently going to biodiversity conservation comes from philanthropic and public sources. That's right now that is about 80+%. However, there's very little growth potential from those two domains. And that's why that we're under a lot of pressure to seek these new revenue streams. Right? And private capital is one that's been identified as having great potential. So we can think of the role of private capital sort of, across this sort of continuum, right? Where you have philanthropy at one end, where an investor in that case really is only, investing or donating money because they care about some social or environmental outcome. On the other extreme, you have mainstream investing, where the investor is primarily concerned with getting a high return. Impact investing occurs in that middle spot, right? And in those cases, an investor both wants to have some good outcome. So in the case of conservation, they want to have some pro-environmental, pro-conservation outcome, but they also want to either get some return on that investment, or at least protect that capital, maybe in a sort of patient capital model. And there have been some large scale analyses that show that there is really high demand for sustainable investments these kinds of environmental impact investments. Much the same way there's been growing demand for social impact investments. But we're not yet at a point where we have enough supply of those kinds of investments or projects on the ground to satisfy the demand that exists. So the idea behind private investments in conservation is that healthy ecosystems and biodiversity can actually provide a wide range of benefits to people. Right? We all know about the various ecosystem services that are provisioned by healthy environments, the different extractive resources that we can, use and depend upon. All of these things can be monetized in ways that can actually draw interest from investors. Of course, there are lots of devils in the details, and that's why there's been a coalition formed to really pursue this and try to mainstream and sort of build this field of private investing in conservation, something that we also refer to as conservation finance. So this coalition for the private investment in conservation is bringing together partners from around the world, including some really big players like IUCN and the Nature Conservancy, in an effort to come up with different plans and strategies for how we can use these approaches to really leverage and support conservation efforts around the world. So if you have interest in this, you can actually get involved. And so if you were to Google CPIC, you'll find information about how to do that. There are so many conservation needs and so much that needs to be done still. But there are so many opportunities to be more strategic and effective. So today we've discussed several ways that we can try to be more strategic in what we aim to conserve, where and when we direct those efforts, and with whom we engage. The hope is that these approaches can be really translated into positive outcomes on the ground, for birds and for other wildlife. And of course, it's not only about the birds. Right? These bird declines signal important changes in our environment that can affect us too. And after all, birds are the proverbial canary in the coal mine. Right? When they aren't doing well in an environment, it's likely that we aren't going to either. So where does that leave us? Well, we have lost 3 billion birds. But if we work together, we can bring them back. And I look forward to doing that with all of you. So thank you to all of the groups and individuals who've supported and contributed to this work. This is definitely a team effort. And so I really want to recognize and appreciate the contributions of everyone involved.